Wow, so it appears that Ben Shapiro and Representative Ro Khanna, Progressive Ro Khanna, had a debate about the $15 minimum wage, something that Ro Khanna is very supportive of. And it was basically a complete and utter destruction entirely of Ben Shapiro. And so we're going to kind of go through some of this. Now, a lot of people in the comment section of the video are applauding Ro Khanna for coming on, first of all, to coming on to do a debate, and then second of all, for really being a policy-based debate. And Ro Khanna, for you guys who are progressives, may want to know that Ro Khanna is becoming more and more of a national name as time goes on. He was getting a lot of coverage during the Nancy Pelosi thing where she wouldn't take the smaller stimulus bill. So he's starting to get a lot more of this kind of attention. And you're going to see that Ro Khanna really knows his shit, okay? You know when somebody really knows stuff. And Ro Khanna has always been this policy wonk. He's clearly a very, very intelligent person who really knows details of policies. He's not somebody who just kind of says, $15 minimum wage or just these kinds of platitudes. He really knows the details on it, studies about it, the way the markets work and things of that nature. So we're just going to go through some of this. Go watch the whole thing. It's only 12 minutes, so it's a very quick watch. But there are a lot of interesting points. And so one of the interesting parts that I saw was Ro Khanna points out that studies show that in the long run, businesses are often more profitable when they're paying a $15 minimum wage. And Ben responds saying if it was profitable for businesses, that they would actually do it.
On this, my view is that the country would be better off with a higher wage that would help productivity, help the happiness of our employees.
I mean, the simple kind of rebuttal to that is if it really improved profitability for businesses to provide higher wages, then they would do it. Meaning you wouldn't need the government to actually step in and force them to do it, being that businesses are profit-driven primarily.
It's a fair point that if you believe that businesses always are acting in their rational long-term interest, my view is that sometimes businesses are very short-term focused and may not be making the long-term investments.
But the thing about that is Ro Khanna then points out that businesses actually look at profits in a short-term manner, especially in the United States. The United States is much more of a get-rich-quick kind of idea. It's not more of a long-term stability thing. And it also assumes that businesses are always acting rational. Now, this seems to be a tenet of libertarianism, which Ben Shapiro is on economics. Is that humans, always act rational, but that's just not the case. And actually, in most cases, they don't act rational, I would argue, in economics in the U.S., especially for businesses. So, this idea that if it was profitable for them, they would absolutely do it themselves is not really true. And so what we see from these studies on $15 minimum wages, businesses have way less turnover rates because they're actually getting paid. Workers are getting paid a decent wage. And so, workers at a business like Costco, for example, get paid a good amount of money. And so businesses don't have to keep going through the process of finding employees, retraining, doing nonstop just trainings of employees because they have such a high turnover rate. That negatively impacts the profitability of your business. And so, business like Costco pays a good amount of money for a minimum wage. And so you have a less turnover rate, and that is more profitable for sure. And so that's one of those examples. Now, another good part I thought was, Ben Shapiro brings up the point, this is going to this is going to be tough for small businesses to take on. Now, there's two routes you can go when somebody says this, right? Small businesses are going to be hurt by $15 minimum wage. There's one route which is, oh, well, if you're a small business and you can't afford to pay a living wage to your employees, you don't deserve to exist. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my entire life, because the logical conclusion of that is the only businesses that will exist are literal massive corporations that can afford it. That's very stupid, and small business is absolutely required and should absolutely be supported. So that's a horrible, horrible argument. The other side is, oh yeah, that's true, and we need to aid small businesses as the government.
When you were criticized for some comments that you made about the minimum wage and small businesses, the implication seemed to be that if businesses weren't paying a higher minimum wage, then maybe they didn't deserve to be in business. So what did you mean by those comments?
Well, let me clarify it. I am a strong supporter of small business. I understand the need for small business. I do believe in a $15 minimum wage. My belief is that the Amazons, Targets, Walmarts can easily pay that. But I understand that small businesses may have a difficult time in doing that. That's why it needs to be gradual, and that's why we need to have tax credits and other assistance to small business so that they can do that.
Other countries do this, where they give wage subsidies to small businesses. That's the answer. The answer is yes. I concede. That is a good point. We need to give aid to small businesses in order to help them be able to bear the brunt, to be able to pay a living wage, because we understand the value of a small business, and we understand the value of, or the struggle of, small businesses to be able to afford these wages. So that, Ro Khanna doing that right there, not only is it intellectually honest, it's a convincing, persuasive argument, but it gives a lot of the people who are watching a higher sense of admiration for him, essentially, and he ends up, pulling people to his side, right? You can read the comment section yourself. Also there you see Ben Shapiro claiming that, workers have bargaining power right now. That's absolutely hilarious. And
again, I think free labor is able to bargain. And if you can come up with a case where you have an actual monopoly that is violating labor law in its attempts to cram down a wage on a person who's unwilling to accept it, first of all, we have an amendment to the Constitution that prevents involuntary servitude. And second of all, bargaining power is still a thing. I mean, the fact is that there are wages that people cannot charge because people will not take the jobs for those wages. I mean, that does exist. And by the way, if you're worried about wages being depressed, then there's a case to be made that one of the things we should be worried about is cracking down on businesses that are using illegal immigration in states like California, for example.
But what would you say to the argument for monopsony, which even Friedman argues? Now, in fairness, he says this is a rare case, and he was against minimum wage, just in fairness. But he says, look, there are cases where you have one or two employers in a town and they're not charging a competitive price because you don't have the choice to go to 4 or 5 different employers. And in those cases, it's a market failure.
Any non-unionized, situation, you do not have real bargaining power, especially against, you're talking about like some pretty big corporations. I mean, you really think you have bargaining power against those? That's so laughable. So Ro Khanna just says, and I don't view it that way. And I think, in general, if you were to, set that question up for people, I think they'd be like, no, of course not. They don't have bargaining power. That's the reason for the need for unionization, is because a big corporation has way too much power for any single person to be able to fight, especially to fight for a wage. So no, absolutely, they don't have bargaining. And unions have been quashed really, really hard by corporations, as well as corporations taking over the government and using the government as a vehicle to quash them. So unionization is very, very important for that reason. And under Ben's own ideology, you wouldn't have that kind of unionization. And so what Ro does here is he gets off from being on the defensive and he puts the pressure on Ben Shapiro, right? This is what any great debater does, is you don't let yourself be in the defense the entire time. You put the pressure on the other person and start making them run like a hamster in a cycle, right? And so he goes, well, what is your idea? What is the floor for you?
But the second case is, let me ask you, are there any times you believe that the government should interfere? For example, overtime laws. We're required to pay time and a half. Would you support that? There are a lot of times that the state has made regulations to say that this helps the bargaining power and makes for a better labor market.
Yeah, and I'm very much against virtually all of that. I'm extremely libertarian when it comes to labor markets, particularly because I believe that monopoly is actually created by some of the regulatory innovations that people.
Right, but the question is, there should be a national floor. And now I'm saying the floor should be $15. Do you believe there should be any floor? Do you think, $7.25 I think is unreasonable. For example, Cotton and Romney have said the floor should be $10. I think Holly is saying it should be $15, but for billion corporations, where would you set the floor?
Unfortunately, there is a floor, and the floor is zero, and it's going to be felt by 1.4 million people who won't have a job come 2025 if we raise this to $15 minimum wage.
I guess my question is for you, would you support any national federal minimum wage at any standard?
No.
And this is a question that should be asked, and Ben Shapiro says he doesn't support any minimum wage, and that, doesn't support virtually any of these labor regulations, unionization. He says overtime there, he doesn't support minimum wage. These are extremely radical beliefs. These conversations, generally speaking, are what should the minimum wage be? What extent to should the labor regulations be? Ben Shapiro says, I don't want any of them. So Ro Khanna not only is a politician trying to win elections and win over the people to his side and convince people, but in this debate, essentially, you're not going to win anything arguing for, in politics, in electoral politics, you won't win anything arguing in favor of, $0 minimum wage and just let the market work, especially given the market failures that Ro Khanna brings up. And so Ro Khanna puts himself in a position as a populist because it's a moral thing to have the minimum wage placed at a living wage so people can actually live their lives in decency, of course. And so he puts the pressure on him, essentially. You can see Ben kind of starts to start laughing, and he starts to get a little nervous because he's kind of revealing, how extreme libertarian his beliefs on economics are. And in general, if you are to phrase a debate that way, vast majority of people are not going to be in favor of Ben's position. They'll be more in favor of Ro Khanna's position. Of course, you see Ro Khanna pointing out monopolies and market failures there, of course, too. That was very important to do because in regional areas, it is true, there may be only a couple employers, and so you especially have even less bargaining power than you may in a regular situation. He talks about market failures, which is definitely a really important thing to do because the market isn't going to work in every single area, every single way. It's just not going to work that way. Also recall that Seattle had that one study that had a lot of, negative impacts from $15 minimum wage. I don't know if that was because it didn't include any of big business, but there was a reversal study like 1 year later where they basically retracted all of their claims. So there's actually a lot of studies proving that $15 minimum wage is actually beneficial all across the board. But making your workers happier, having less worker turnover, those are absolutely beneficial for the long-term profitability of your business, of your enterprise. Do small businesses need help from the government? Likely because the living wage is too much for them to run? Absolutely. And we should institute a policy in which we have subsidies where we can directly give them money to pay for their workers to cover, whatever sliver they need to cover it, the differential, the deficit between what they can afford and, what is the living wage. So Ro Khanna here just put on a clinic, basically just demolished Ben Shapiro and everything. And I think this is what happens to Ben Shapiro when he debates somebody as educated and clearly as intelligent as Ro Khanna is. When he's not debating somebody who's a college kid, or, in a lot of those college debates, they don't even have a back and forth, really. It's just like one or two statements and that's it. So it's not even really fair. But man, Ro Khanna, that's some presidential shit right there, because not only for reading the comment section can you tell that he's gained respect from across the aisle, which makes him really, palatable to both sides because he's respectful, he's clearly intelligent, he knows what he's talking about. He's clearly a pretty, good orator, I would say. He has a very calm demeanor to him. That's definitely some presidential level stuff. But man, good on Ro Khanna. But you could always tell really from day one that Ro Khanna he really knew what he was talking about in depth. Like he's a policy wonk. That's what he is. He knows the details of every policy that you want to know. That's just who Ro Khanna is.